Okay, welcome back. Hi, once again, another walk and talk. Ha ha! Walk and talk, right? I'm so charming. Another walk and talk. Today, we're going to be talking about the Bronze Age collapse and the Greek Dark Age, and sort of leading up to the Classical Age of Greece. So, this is following on the discussion of Mycenaean social structure. Okay, so, sometime around 1000 BCE, right around the end of the second millennium BCE, the various dominant societies in the Fertile Crescent and around the Mediterranean, most of them kind of just shit the bed. I mean, they just sort of collapsed. Let me give you a little overview on what was the situation at that time. So, by this point, the dominant Mesopotamian culture were the Hittites. And I use Mesopotamian there in the cultural sense rather than the geographical sense, because the Hittites originated in, I guess, probably what we would now call Turkey is the best place to put their point of origin, right near the Zagreb Mountains. If you recall, if you look at the maps in the book, the Fertile Crescent is a crescent, starting from the Persian Gulf down here, where Sumerian culture got started in Uruk and Ur and all those places back in 3000, 3500. At where the Tigris and Euphrates dump into the Persian Gulf down here, and the Fertile Crescent follows the path of the Tigris and Euphrates up towards the Zagreb Mountains, and then curves back down along the coastline of the Mediterranean through what would be now modern-day Syria and Israel, places like that. Pretty much to where it sort of merges into, kind of hits the top of the Arabian and the Sinai Peninsula, or things like that. It sort of shades into Egypt. So this is a strip of land in an otherwise pretty arid country that is, as the name says, fertile and very suitable for agriculture. It's very lush, beautiful land. If you've never been there, look at some pictures from those areas. Lovely place, lovely climate, pretty good in general. Again, remember, over on the eastern part of the Fertile Crescent, so here we have Egypt, moving up along the Mediterranean to the Zagreb Mountains, back down the paths of the Tigris and Euphrates. In the eastern half, which is what we would call Mesopotamia, that's where we started off talking about civilization, and it was a cradle of civilization because of all of the favorable aspects of that region for agriculture. So, okay. So you've got the Fertile Crescent, then you've got kind of just up here, to the, if you're looking at a map, left and upwards, so north and west of the Fertile Crescent, you've got the peninsula where we would find modern-day Turkey, okay? And then just left of that, so west of that, there's modern-day mainland Greece, right? And then if you come down across the Mediterranean, just in a little arc, you're back at Egypt, which, again, is right there at the bottom of that Fertile Crescent arch on the left side, on the western part of it. So you've got this sort of pretty well connected group of civilizations, right? From the Mesopotamian civilizations down through the ones along the coast of the Mediterranean, on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, Egypt, kind of jot up through the Mediterranean there to Crete with the Minoans, and then mainland Greece with the Mycenaeans, and then that brings you back across to the peninsula where Turkey is, and then you're right there back at the top of the Fertile Crescent. So again, you have maps in your reading. Please look at them. This is harder than I have a whiteboard behind me. I could insert something into the video. I may do that later. Right now, I'm just focused on getting this content up so that you can watch it. So I'll upload the raw versions, and then I'll upload the versions that have been edited with all the special effects and nifty stuff like that. Okay, so here's the deal. There were a lot of these civilizations. So you have the Hittites, who have sort of dominated the peninsula where modern-day Turkey is, and then down into a good portion of the Mesopotamian region. They've also pushed their influence down along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. You've got Egypt, which for the first time in its history has a lot of foreign holdings. Egypt, as the readings discuss, and as we'll talk about in the Egypt video, Egypt was typically very insular, kept to itself, but during this period, the latter half of the second millennium, Egypt had expanded and was actually holding regions all the way up through modern-day Syria, through modern-day Israel, modern-day Syria, on the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And they came into conflict with the Hittites over this. They were fighting over this territory. And then, of course, over here, you've got the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. All right. So, right around, within 100 years or so, a couple hundred years, right around the 1000 BCE, and that's 100 years, 200 years, give or take on either side. Right around that period, the Hittite Empire collapses. The Egyptians, the end of the Middle Kingdom comes, and or is that the New Kingdom? Well, no, it's the Middle Kingdom, I'm pretty sure. The end of the Middle Kingdom comes, and they go through a period of chaos, and they sort of lose their foreign holdings out in modern-day Israel, modern-day Syria. They lose out on all that, and after that, the Egyptians go back to pretty much keeping to themselves. Minoan culture collapses, undergoes complete economic collapse. Mycenaean culture undergoes a collapse. All these things happen right around then. This is called the Bronze Age collapse, because this period that we were in is called the Bronze Age. Pretty much from the beginning of Sumerian culture around 3000 BCE to about this period, right around the end of second millennium BCE, so right around 1000, that's the Bronze Age. It's called the Bronze Age because they came in third place. No, I'm kidding. It's called the Bronze Age because the primary metal that was used for weapons, armor, tools, and the various other industrial purposes was bronze, which is, say, copper mixed with tin, maybe zinc. It's a lesser form of bronze, but still tin usually. It's harder than regular copper. It's not as good as iron, but they hadn't figured out how to get large deposits of iron out of the ground and work them yet. in this period. So bronze was the main metal. Okay, your book goes into more detail about that. All right, so here's the deal. Why would all of these cultures have gone kablooey at roughly the same time? What happened? Alien invasion? Aliens. Right? Aliens? Maybe. No, I'm kidding. It wasn't aliens. God. When are you guys going to stop saying aliens? Aliens. Was it my stupid cat knocking shit over? Because that's kind of what I'm thinking now. We're fine. Everything's fine. No. Here's what was going on. Now, bear in mind, even to this day, historians have only a loose grasp on what happened to bring about the end of the to bring about the Bronze Age collapse. But spoiler, one of the big speculations has to do with the fact that the Bronze Age collapse happens at the end of the Bronze Age. Some of you are like, well, no shit, the Bronze Age collapsed, then the Bronze Age is over. It's not what I mean. What I mean is, after this period, sort of starting roughly in the early first millennium BCE, we start seeing the appearance pretty regularly of iron weapons, tools, armor, stuff like that. People had figured out how to make or how to extract iron ore, to work it effectively, and to create iron tools and weapons and armor. Now, you may be thinking, big deal, an iron sword versus a bronze sword, who gives a crap? Alright, in our modern world of, laminate body armor and rapid fire automatic weapons, the distinction may not seem significant. But the fact is, in that world, it was kind of like someone had invented nuclear weapons. Iron is much sturdier than bronze. It holds an edge better. It's a lot less likely to break. Iron armor is going to be able to deflect or blunt bronze weapons very easily, whereas bronze armor is not going to stand up to iron weapons nearly as well. So if you've got two armies with equal numbers of people and neither one's doing anything stupid, and one of them has iron weapons, one of them has bronze weapons, smart money is going for the iron weapons 9 times out of 10. This was a massive advantage in military operations. So you see where I'm going with this. Okay. There were a number of factors. Let's back off of that for a second and talk in more general terms. There were a number of factors that did or may have contributed to the Bronze Age collapse. The most notable one is the arrival of what various documents, especially the Egyptians, refer to as the Sea People. And that's sea as in S-E-A, the people from the sea. Which is to say that they showed up on boats and attacked the Egyptian colonies, not so much Central Egypt itself, although a little bit, but that was pretty well defended. But they certainly attacked the Egyptian colonies. They gave the Hittites a lot of problems coming across the Black Sea. There's some evidence that they gave the Mycenaeans a lot of problems. There's a lot going on. Now, who were these sea peoples that showed up and just sort of wrecked everything? Well, in one sense, we know exactly who they are. In the other sense, we don't know anything about them. The sea peoples themselves left no records, probably because they had no writing. Maybe they left behind a little bit of material culture, but without any further context, it's still hard to put any meaning to the artifacts we have that might be associated with them. The sea people, we're on an 8% incline this time, which is why I'm already panicking. The sea people, our best guess is that they come from north of the Black Sea, which puts them roughly in Eastern Europe and maybe the Ukraine area. So they were nomads, perhaps, of some kind. Maybe extensive agriculturalists rather than intensive agriculturalists, or pastoralists. Regardless of which, they were the very paradigm model of what I was talking about in previous videos of a quote-unquote barbarian culture that exists outside of the zone of intensive agricultural cultivation. Which is to say that they were living on the fringes of a society where people were gathering massive agricultural surpluses, and they themselves did not have all this extra food and all this extra, and as a result, because remember, when you have massive agricultural surpluses, you're able to support a large population of non-farmers, specialists who learn to do things like make crafts better, to make art. Look at all the Sumerian, the Mesopotamian art in your book. These lovely items. This is the result of these massive agricultural surpluses that give you time for some people to not farm and to just spend all their time getting better at making stuff. I don't know if any of you are art majors, but you know, if you've done any kind of art or practiced an instrument, it takes a lot of time. And if you think about that, we don't think about this very often in our culture today, because we are very nearly a post-agricultural culture. Not quite, but very nearly. Every bit of time that I spend doing something that isn't growing my own food has to be subsidized, if you will, by someone else who is growing food. It's not like I say, oh, I don't need to eat. I'm a philosopher, or I'm an artist, or I like to repair vending machines, or whatever, right? Whatever my job is, unless it's growing food, someone else is going to have to grow enough food to feed them and me for that to happen. So, what you have in these early societies that created large agricultural surpluses, like Mesopotamian society, other societies in the Fertile Crescent, Egypt. I told you in the video on the Greeks, on the Bronze Age Greeks anyway, that the Mycenaeans and the Minoans didn't generate large agricultural surpluses. That's true, they didn't, not on the scale of the societies in the Fertile Crescent, but they generated enough to sustain at least a modest urban culture, and they traded for the rest. So, we are talking about people, the sea peoples probably did not have that. So the sea peoples, pretty much every member of their society was responsible for growing food, hunting, fighting. There was probably less differentiation in terms of skill. Now, this is not an all or nothing thing. It's not like a light switch. It's like a dimmer switch, right? It's a scale. The sea people were probably not simple hunter-gatherers because they did manage to build boats. But they were almost certainly living with a much lower margin of surplus agricultural production than the quote-unquote civilized peoples of the Bronze Age. So what do you do when you have boats and weapons and a culture where every adult male has to fight, and you see a bunch of people who have more food than you, they have nicer stuff than you, and they have, on the large part, fewer warriors than you. The warriors they have are professionals, but there aren't as many of them. You go get that stuff, right? You go get it. The Mesopotamian civilizations had always had to deal with warfare from these so-called barbarian cultures, these cultures that existed on the fringes of intensive agricultural development and that wanted to come in and take their stuff. That was a constant situation. What's different about the Sea Peoples is, well, okay, first of all, we don't know exactly what's different about them, but we can reasonably infer a few things. First of all, if the Sea Peoples managed to wreck so very much shit in this period, it's safe to say that at this particular point in history, there was a larger concentration of them, and they were more motivated. Now, why? I don't know, your guess is as good as mine. Some people have speculated that microclimate change caused it, that there was a period of cooling off, and the areas that they lived in and normally were able to make a decent living in became less hospitable, and so they were desperate, which is to say highly motivated, to move in to these areas of civilization and take what those people had. Maybe. I mean, you can see a similar kind of operation in effect in the 4th and 5th century CE in Europe, when, for various reasons, pressures from the east in Europe, from what we would now call the Ukraine and Russia, forced a lot of, I guess, people in what we would now call Germany, Czechoslovakia, Austria, things like that, forced a lot of the so-called barbarian tribes there to move out of their traditional homelands into Roman territory, because they had these lunatics coming at them from the east, the Huns. So you can see kinds of migratory pressures a lot. The difference is that the Sea People didn't migrate. They didn't leave their traditional lands, as far as we can tell. Everything in this video that talks about the Sea People has a little asterisk that says, as far as we can tell. History is not a perfect science. There's lots of gaps. We're guessing at a lot of stuff based on the evidence. But the Sea People, as far as we can tell, did not migrate into the lands of the Fertile Crescent and the Eastern Mediterranean. They raided and took things and then left. So maybe their homeland wasn't occupied by someone else. It was just producing less food than it usually did. So they could go back to their homeland. They just needed more stuff to take with them. I don't know. Another possibility as to how the Sea People were able to make such a devastating impression on a set of societies that had always dealt with incursions from outsiders is that maybe the Sea People had better access to iron. Maybe that was part of it. Maybe the Sea People had more iron weapons per capita, so to speak, than those civilizations. In fact, maybe that's where the influx of iron that kind of kicks off the Iron Age starts. I don't know. It would be like if aliens invaded Earth very briefly and left behind some laser weapons that were just advanced enough that they were effective, but also not so advanced that we couldn't copy them. And so after the aliens leave, we start copying them, and soon everybody's got laser weapons. Think of it like that, right? Maybe the Sea People and their iron weapons, which they might have had, flow into this region. They do a lot of damage with these new high-tech fancy iron weapons. But they're going to leave some of them lying around. And people start looking at them and they start going, hey, I recognize this stuff. And this kicks off a new era of metallurgy. And suddenly iron weapons are everywhere. Right? Maybe that should happen. I don't know. There's a lot we don't know about the Sea Peoples. And maybe the Sea Peoples were not so much better as they were lucky. So let's move on to that. Maybe they just hit at the right time. Maybe they were able to devastate these cultures because these cultures were already vulnerable. Now, why would the cultures have been vulnerable, you say? Well, first of all, the Hittite Empire, which was kind of the major player on the scene other than the Egyptians, the Hittite Empire was arguably overextended. It was huge. It was probably the biggest empire in that region to date. And it might have just reached the limits of its ability to coordinate a defense on an area that size. So maybe that made it vulnerable. Maybe, and we're not sure, maybe there were, climatic factors. Maybe there were a couple of years of bad harvests, and everybody was low on food, and hunger had reduced the population. We can't be positive. One thing that we have more evidence of is that there were a lot of earthquakes in that region right around that time. Now, which is my favorite thing, an archaeogeologist. That's the coolest sounding job ever, right? An archaeogeologist, whose name escapes me, has written on the evidence that under the right circumstances, the tectonic plates, as the structure of them goes in that region, under the right circumstances, the tectonic plates in that region could produce not just one or two unconnected earthquakes, but a kind of cascading series of earthquakes where one sets off another, which sets off another, which sets off another, and so on and so forth. And he called this an earthquake storm. Earthquake storm! I swear to God, if I played an instrument, I would make that the name of my metal band. Earthquake storm! Right? It's cool. You can use it. I give you permission. Use that for your band name. I want to see it. Earthquake storm. Now opening for, I don't know, whoever's not dead. Is Ozzy alive? Sure, him. Whatever. Ozzy's totally going to die soon. You know that, right? Anyway. Earthquake storm. We have a lot of evidence that some of the settlements in that region were devastated by earthquakes. Not all of them. Earthquakes don't account for everything bad that happened, but they certainly do account for a number of bad things that happened to settlements in that region in that time. So, yeah, maybe the Sea People had better weapons. Maybe they were highly motivated. Maybe they just hit during a vulnerable period. A period where lines of communication and the ability to move food around was inhibited by the devastation caused by an earthquake storm. I'm going to say earthquake storm as much as possible, by the way. If you're playing a drinking game to this video that involves the phrase earthquake storm, you might be dead. Earthquake storm. Ha ha! Sorry. So, okay. We're not 100% sure. That's the point. All we do know is that the Hittite civilization collapsed, the Egyptians lost their foreign colonies, the Minoan civilization collapsed, and the Mycenaean civilization collapsed, all within a couple hundred years of each other. And we know the Sea Peoples existed and did terrible things, and then kind of vanished back to wherever the hell they came from, wherever the Helliscan, or, wherever the Hellsville, whatever. And we know there was an earthquake storm, or at least we have strong evidence there was. So, bad time. Almost as bad as 2020. Anyway. So, the end of the Bronze Age comes with an utter collapse of the dominant civilizations that characterized the last half of the Bronze Age. The Egyptians were the only ones that kind of rode it out. They lost their foreign colonies, but homeland Egypt, the Nile River Valley, remained relatively untouched for reasons that we talk about in the Egypt video. Okay, so let's talk about civilization collapse and so-called Dark Ages. What do I mean by their civilization collapsed? Right? Sometimes when you read history books, as I know you all do for fun, sometimes when you read history books, you get the feeling that when they talk about the Hittite civilization collapsing, they make it sound almost like all the Hittites were like friggin' beamed up. Like there were suddenly these words in the sky that said the Hittite civilization is over. And the Hittites are like, oh shit, already? All right, see you, Bob. And they punch the clock and they leave and we never see them again. Obviously, that's not what happened. The Hittite civilization collapsed, but all of the people that were in that civilization were still there. Well, most of them. A bunch of them died probably of famine and from sea peoples and stuff like that. But most of them were still there. So what do we mean by the Hittite civilization vanished or collapsed? Like the Minoan civilization vanished. There's still friggin' people living on Crete. Aren't they descendants of the Minoans? What happened? All right. When we talk about a certain civilization like the Hittites or the Minoans, we're talking about a culture, a set of patterns, a set of practices, a language, a certain way of dressing, styles of art, a regime of laws, in particular, a system of government, things like that. For instance, imagine there's like a zombie apocalypse. Like think about The Walking Dead. Right? In The Walking Dead, I don't know if you've ever seen it or read the comic, but the main point of view character is a guy named Rick Grimes. They live in Georgia, and he's a sheriff. And anyway, in this post-apocalyptic zombie wasteland, Rick still frequently wears his sheriff outfit. Is he a sheriff? Well, the obvious answer is no. Because a sheriff is a kind of official position in a government. And that government no longer functions or exists. There are no courts operating anymore. There's no one at City Hall. There's nobody paying him. There's no American government in these areas anymore. It's gone. They still have the same language. They still speak English. But their culture is utterly changed as well. Nobody's watching the new episodes of RuPaul's Drag Race. Why? Because it doesn't exist. Right? There's no television being broadcast. There are no radio stations to be listened to. Not that you guys listen to radio now anyway. There are no podcasts. There you go. Now I'm talking to the youths. There are no podcasts. I'm so old. Their culture that they had, American culture as such, is kind of gone. It's gone. Right? Certainly, American civilization is. It's gone. Right? Nobody's restocking the stores. Football is not happening. So what I'm saying is the Bronze Age collapse canceled the Hittite football season. I'm kidding. I have to put that disclaimer in there because someone is always going to put that in a test. And non-jokingly, I think. But no, seriously. When I say the Hittite civilization collapsed, what I mean is the central areas that were ruled by the Hittite emperor were released kind of back into their own control because the emperor could no longer maintain a presence. He couldn't enforce his will. He couldn't enforce his laws. He couldn't enforce his edicts. And the peripheral areas, of course, were totally cut off. Right? Those would have been cut out of the loop pretty early on. Maybe people dressed more or less the same, but some of it would have to change because trade has collapsed. Right? Large-scale trade that can be facilitated by a sizable instrument of government is gone. Right? So the materials they have available are going to change. The food that they have available is going to be restricted. Travel is going to be restricted. All of these things are going to happen when you get the collapse of the central urban areas. But Professor Schertz, why did the central urban areas collapse? I'm glad you asked that, Timmy. In my world, Timmy is my fictional student who asks questions. Or maybe Tammy. We'll alternate. How about that? Timmy wants to know, why would I think that the cities would collapse? Well, I've given you a hint earlier in this video, haven't I? What do cities, in other words, places where a bunch of non-farmers live, what do cities require? That's right, surplus agricultural products. For every person who isn't farming, there has to be someone who is farming enough for 2 people. Get it? If 10 people aren't farming, somebody's got to be farming enough for 11 people. And that requires organization, that requires technology, that requires oversight. And that's just in the raw agricultural output. You got to figure some of that's going to be lost when the food is moved, when the food is stored. So the less efficient and the less effective that the mechanisms of collecting, storing, and redistributing the food are, the more will be lost. And the less of an urban population you will be able to support. Well, guess what? As it happens, earthquakes, invasions by loony-ass sea people, and quite possibly climatic change are all bad for agricultural production and the efficient collection, storing, and redistribution of agricultural products. Who knew? So what does that mean? Well, that means if you are a farmer, you're going to hang on to as much of your product as you can for yourself, rather than giving it to stupid non-farmers. And that only makes sense because if you did that, if you gave all your product to support the non-farming population, you would die, and then there would be no more food products for anyone. Okay. So what we have is a situation where the food supply contracts, and because the food supply is contracting, the people who aren't producing food go away first. That means the artisans who produce the art and the culture. That means the people who write shit down. That means the rulers who exercise authority, many of whom probably died in fighting too. Imagine it this way. Think about the zombie apocalypse again. Why is RuPaul's Drag Race no longer being broadcast? Well, part of it might be because RuPaul was canonically eaten by a zombie. That's a joke. I don't actually know. I don't think Robert Kirkland ever addresses the fate of RuPaul in Walking Dead. But if he did, you'll be the first to know about it. No, rather, the case is that if you think about it, people in cities, we don't grow or hunt our own food for the most part. I'm sure some of you in my class, I've always got at least a few people who either are farmers or grew up on farms, or have family who are farmers, and if they needed to, they could go back to growing or hunting their own food. Fine. I could not. I have zero useful skills when it comes to that. In a zombie apocalypse, I'm going to die fast. And it doesn't even have to be from zombie bites, right? Because it's not like grocery stores are being restocked, are they? They're not. The food is not being moved effectively from the production, the farms where it's being produced, to the places where non-farmers can get it. It's not being moved that way because there's no ability to maintain safe and effective means of doing so. That's what happens when government collapses. So, you're in a situation where all the people who can't grow or hunt their own food, even if they aren't killed by sea peoples or earthquakes, they're going to run out of food very quickly. Well, hell, right? I die first. But think about what dies with me. If I die, who do you know that can explain the Bronze Age collapse? I mean, maybe a few people, but those people are mostly in the same boat as I am. They lack survival skills because they spent their whole lives learning about the Bronze Age collapse and other stuff. So, we're in a situation where people with valuable skills, in other words, skills that go into making up what we would call the culture of a people, or at least the culture that's preserved. I'm being very unfair to folk culture here. That is to say, oral traditions that are passed down. I'm being very unfair to that. I'm equating urban, non-agricultural culture with just culture. And that's not completely fair. But I want you to understand that's the view that historical analysis typically takes. That's where we are. The people that create the kind of high culture associated with a particular civilization go away. They either die in the wars or from the earthquakes, or they get starved. Or they figure out how to farm, and that takes up all their time. And they're not talking about the Bronze Age collapse anymore, right? I don't know, if I didn't teach this stuff every semester after 20 years, some of the details might get a little slippery for me. The point is, you can see now how it makes sense to say that the Hittite civilization collapsed. What we mean by that is the Hittite ways of life that are characteristic of their urban environment vanish. Hittite art vanishes. Hittite laws and politics vanish because all of the people who were in charge of that stuff either died or went back to farming. Okay. Hittite urban centers shrink. Some of them go away completely, either because of earthquakes or because there's no longer enough food to sustain a population there. So this is what we mean by the collapse of Hittite civilization. Other civilizations, smaller scale, can maybe move in and fill that vacuum as they start to accumulate agricultural surplus sufficient to develop a characteristic high culture, you might say. One of the examples of this is a semi-nomadic pastoralist population, a fairly small one at that, living at the very top, the apex of the Fertile Crescent near the Zagreb Mountains. So they had access to iron ore. And they, in the power vacuum left, after the Hittites went away and stopped being able to control their territory, they moved southwest along the Fertile Crescent into Palestine and Syria and fought with and took control over that area, establishing dominance over that region, and founded the Kingdom of Israel around 1000 BCE. It's the Israelites. They moved in where the Hittites and the Egyptians had enjoyed a strong political presence. In other words, the early Israelites could never have kicked the Hittites out of that area. They could never have kicked the Egyptians out of that area. But when the Bronze Age collapse is happening, and the Hittites have other things to worry about, and the Egyptians have stopped caring what goes on outside of the Nile River Valley, well, there's opportunities to be had, right? They saw opportunity. They could move from less fertile land to more fertile land, bring their superior weapons, and dominate and set up a new kingdom there, which is what they did. Now, that kingdom only lasts about 3 generations before it splits in half due to internal conflicts, some of which have to do with the question of how much the local population is mixing with their Israelite conquerors. And then that goes on for a while before the Neo-Babylonians in the 5th, 6th century BCE comes in and wipes them out, destroys the temple, so on and so forth, leads them off into the Babylonian captivity, etc. But my point is, you can see how the collapse of these major powers is going to change the face of the politics in the region. You guys are mostly too young, but in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union kind of went and it collapsed, Eastern European politics was crazy because there were these people that had lived for the past 80 years under the dominion of a central government in Moscow that now they were kind of left to their own devices. And they had to figure out, okay, who's in charge now? And there were a bunch of wars. There were a bunch of civil wars in that area as people tried to sort out who gets to be in charge now. Not dissimilar to these early Israelites moving from the northernmost part of the Fertile Crescent, south and west, into Palestine, and taking over. Okay, so let's run down the leaderboard and see how much people were affected. The Hittite civilization collapsed, but they were pretty strong. They had a pretty robust presence, so there were still a fair number of urban centers left, and at least some high culture, which is to say writing, art, music, things like that, survived into the next age. Egypt came out very well. They lost their foreign possessions outside of the Nile River Valley, and they went through a little period of reorganization internally, but for the most part, Egyptian culture continued on mostly the way it had, which is a characteristic of Egyptian civilization that we talk about in the video on Egypt. The Minoans went completely bluey. Urban civilization, as near as we can tell, completely went away. The only people left were farmers who did not practice any high art, they did not read, they did not write, and Minoan civilization, as we understand it, went away completely. As an additional kick in the pants there, Minoan language, Linear A, we don't know how to translate it. So we can look at Minoan art, but we can't read anything the Minoans wrote. So even the memory of how to translate Minoan writing was lost completely and forever, which sucks. I mean, maybe forever. I should say maybe forever. The knowledge of how to translate Egyptian hieroglyphics was lost sometime 5th century, well, no. It was lost, yeah, maybe by the early Common Era, but it was rediscovered, if you will, in the 1800s due to some archaeological discoveries. So maybe someday we'll figure out Minoan again. For a long time, for over 1,000 years, close to 2,000, nobody alive could read Egyptian hieroglyphs. So, never say never. The Mycenaean culture collapsed, but less thoroughly than the Minoan culture. Urban culture went away almost entirely, but not quite. There was, however, no writing in this period, and it's what we call the Greek Dark Age. And it lasts about 300-400 years, well, maybe a little less. But for several hundred years in Greece, the Mycenaean language as written was lost, and no high art was produced, no figurative art was produced. People were concentrating on farming and getting enough to live on, and that was that. And it took them a couple hundred years to dig themselves out of that hole, get back to a level of sufficient urban production to where they could start writing things down again, to where they could start pursuing more complex forms of art again, and so on and so forth. Now, as an example of how unfair it is to say that culture vanishes during a Dark Age, one of the great works of post-Dark Age literature, maybe the greatest work, which is the Iliad by Homer, or at least commonly attributed to Homer, is an epic poem that was written down probably from an oral tradition that arose during the Dark Age. So they had art, they had culture, they just didn't leave traces of it. And that's where historians get hung up. They start talking about culture went away, culture vanished. Well, it didn't vanish, it just didn't leave any evidence that we can look at. So we need to get over thinking about that in those terms. But the fact is writing, which is a complex cultural skill, did vanish, and that art, at least graphic art, the kind of stuff they put on vases and whatnot, that stuff did get more simplistic. So culture may not have vanished, but it did absolutely regress. Okay, so what we have is Hittites, their distinctive way of life was gone, but there were still a number of urban areas around, and the vacuum left by the Hittites would be filled by a number of new contenders on the scene, including the Israelites. Egypt. Core Egypt remains more or less the same. They just give up their foreign possessions. All in all, relatively unscathed. Minoan culture, gone completely. Screw those guys. Sucks, doesn't it? Mycenaean culture, gone mostly. The Mycenaean language would be reinvented as classical Greek in a script that is similar to, but not identical to, the old Mycenaean script, Linear B. And while the Mycenaeans were clearly still practicing some culture, they still made pottery and decorated it, and they clearly told stories to each other, they didn't write, and we only have fragments of their oral literary culture preserved by writings at the end of the Dark Age. And the art that we do have on pottery is non-figurative, it's purely just geometric shapes, and they wouldn't get back into doing more complex figurative art until after the Dark Age is over. So the Mycenaeans are not going to be replaced by a wholly new civilization. They're going to be replaced by, like, the spin-off, like the Netflix remake, whatever, of Mycenaean culture, which is the classical Greek culture. Egyptian culture is going to change a few details, but is mostly going to stay the same. Hittite culture bombs out pretty much entirely and gets replaced by a bunch of people who the Israelites didn't want to model themselves on the Hittites, but like the Neo-Babylonians did. So the various successors to the Hittite Empire, to a greater or lesser degree, are kind of like Yeah, I'm the new Hittites, right? They're kind of like, I'm the new fresh thing, right? It's kind of like when a musical act gets old and kind of tired and somebody else comes in and they're kind of sort of stealing their thing, but not completely. It's kind of like that. So that's where we are. The Bronze Age collapse, why it happened, what that means, and the Greek Dark Age, which is a period where the Mycenaean culture was basically gone, but little bits and jots of it were preserved through folk crafts and oral traditions to come out on the other side in the classical Greek culture, which is Mycenaean-esque, but is not Mycenaean culture. Okay, hopefully that helps you. Be well, take care. As always, I will upload the raw version of this video to YouTube, and the edited version with like slides and titles and stuff will come up later when I have the time. All right, take care, be well, and don't collapse civilization.